Okay, so let's start off with what is the impact of grief in the workplace?
Thank you, Michael. So the impact of grief in the workplace, many people aware or many people only aware that grief make us sad. And sometimes we also notice that make us not very focused or feel lost is a lot of time. But what people don't realize is actually grief, particularly after the initial phase. And so what I mean by the initial phase is something happened and you feel all the shock and the sadness and so forth. But if you do not navigate, address it, and fully and completely recover from this grief, what happens is most people don't feel the sadness anymore or not as intense. They might have the lingering daily sadness. Is a lot of people whom I work with, a lot of clients who has been through therapy and counseling and coaching and you name it. And they say, well, I'm still sad every day. I'm not crying, bawling every day, but I'm still sad every day. Now, what people don't realize is at that state of grief where we're not intensely sad, but we still have not fully recovered, grief actually kind of transform itself into something else. And typically this is in the forms emotionally and mentally, so to say. Grief make us not think correctly. Imagine wearing the analogy I use is wearing a sunglasses. If you wear sunglasses all the time, and that's grief, it's like you wearing a sunglasses. And you know how people can wear glasses? You wear glasses, Michael. And sometimes people wear glasses and they forgot about it. They're like, where's my glasses? Where's my glasses? It's right on here. And the same thing with grief. You're wearing these dark sunglasses on you. You forgot about it. You don't even realize it's there. But then it's cloud your vision on everything. It causes us to feel overwhelmed. That's one thing. Grief makes us feel overwhelmed. Even without the intensity at the beginning, it still have this underlying restlessness, so to say, and so you feel overwhelmed. And one thing that causes us to, when we feel overwhelmed, naturally, when we look at something else is going on in life, if we already overwhelmed, even the slightest thing will trigger us, will make us kind of blow out of proportion. So if you were at work, usually this team member complain and that client complain, and you kind of like, oh my goodness, I just don't like that. Now, if that's the normal state. But if you have unrecognized in many cases by then and incompletely resolved grief, you're already overwhelmed. This team member complain, you're like, and that client complain, you're like, okay, I'm done with this. I'm quitting. Bye. I'm done. And wonder why there is such a mass exodus and people I'm just done with the after the COVID-19 pandemic, because it's what people don't realize is there has been grief pandemic before the COVID-19, and the COVID-19 kind of exacerbated significantly. The other part is actually physical illness. People don't realize that grief causes incompletely resolved grief cause physical problems. So much so that there are books that discuss that, but also from mysterious ache and pain that you can't get rid of. My book talk about that a little bit, and then also skin problem, endocrine problem. You might have heard the word Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is a very well-known TED talk. Grief causes inflammation in our body. And that inflammation, as many of us know nowadays, will trigger secondary physical problems. So that's the dangers of grief.
When you talk about grief, obviously the number one grief is the loss of a loved one, right, or a friend or whatever. But what are some other forms of grief that people go through?
So the number one, thank you for asking that. The number one grief, and actually I would phrase it, the most commonly recognized grief. Sometimes, and I hear this from many of the 25,000 clients whom I have successfully helped. The many time people said, oh, there is this grief and that this is this. And actually, firstly, if you are listening to this and you are facing some challenge, I want to, first, my heart goes to you. Secondly, there is no grief that's more or less significant than other. For some of us, the loss of a loved one is not a cause of grief. It's a cause of relief, particularly if we have been having to take care of the person or the relationship not ideal or whatever reason. Sometimes that's not. And so the most commonly recognized grief is the cause of the loved one. Grief, that there is no, when it's grief, the grief is grief. There is no bigger grief, smaller grief, good this grief, and so forth. All grief cumulative and cumulatively destructive. But beside the loss of the loved one, there is actually more than 40 different causes of grief, and many of us are not aware of that. And that's because the true definitions of grief is the unsettling feelings caused by loss, hope unmet, or changes. Let me ask you, Michael, do you know anyone who has not experienced any change, say, in the last 3 years?
That's a silly question.
It's one of those that it make us like, oh God, so we had gone through this, and I mentioned briefly about the grief pandemic. Most of us never hear about it unless you are a grief specialist, which is, by the way, is an evidence-based system. It's not we just kind of create it out of the abyss. It's evidence-based. But unless that, we never hear about the grief pandemic, nor most company whom I work with and help never even realize that the impact of grief. It is grief in 2017 cost businesses 113.7 billion. That's with a B, $1 billion every year in the US alone. And so there's a lot of things people don't not aware about grief yet.
Well, that leads into my next question. How does grief affect productivity in companies and businesses?
So grief affect productivity and in businesses and in companies in quite a few different ways. Firstly, grief causes us to be confused, irritable, defensive, forgetful, and all these things. Whether the initial part of grief or as it's more, it's tend to continue doing that. Now, if you're confused and forgetful, guess what happened to your work? You make mistakes, right? And then if you keep making mistake, you might annoy somebody else is in your team, and that's not the best culture. If you're irritable or forgetful or confused, the same thing. If you're irritable, your team member said something, back to the overwhelmed example that I mentioned earlier, your team member said something and you snap. And that's bad. But imagine if it is an important high profile client said something and you got triggered, incompletely resolved grief caused trigger. And in the past, it would have been just fine. The person said something and you went, bad. Not the ideal thing for businesses, really, to snap at your clients. And so that is and so the culture, it's influence culture, it's influence the outcome. And then in terms of when we don't have cultures, many of us in business know that if we're not happy, we kind of like, I don't want to go to work because I don't like the feeling, the ambience at work, the relationship. You're not going to be productive at work. And that's when we lost productivity, we lost our bottom line. The other part is the illness. The mysterious illness. I have many people come to me from, and they usually come from something else. Sometimes it is come directly. One client I remember come to me because she was facing losing her job. And that's because she has this multiple ache and pain, and in particular migraine, to the point that she has to receive Botox injection directly to the head. Still doesn't work. And we worked together. Within 2 weeks, she realized that, okay, so everything started not long after she received a promotion. which is actually one of the most common cause of grief from the workplace. Promotion. People don't realize that. And before we even complete working together, all her ache and pain and migraine and whatsoever, who has been keeping her from being able to go to work, and that's the reason she was worrying about losing her job, all resolved. And so if your employee, and that's not the only one, it's a grief. We know many studies lower our immunity in this day and age. It causes us prone to become multiple illnesses. And anytime an employee either have to call out or they are having headache or back pain or whatever aching them and influencing them physically, they're not fully productive.
Right.
There's no way you're having headache and be 100% productive, and that goes your bottom line as well. And so it's also grief make us unmotivated. Kind of like when grief takes a lot of energy, people tend to be tired. So if they're tired, they're unmotivated, then they're not going to be inspired to do their very best to grow and help the company grow.
Yeah, it seems like grief kind of ties in with anxiety, so that could be very energy depleting, like you said.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I like to keep these around 10 minutes or so, so I'm gonna end it here. But I get so many other questions that I wanted to ask you, but I wanted to kind of keep this 10 minutes or so. So I'm gonna end it right now, and.